Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I've always loved the solitude of the open road. There's something about those long, empty stretches of highway that just let you clear your head. It's like the world falls away, and it's just you, your rig, and the hum of the engine. Some people hate it, the isolation, the hours with nothing but their own thoughts, but for me, it's a kind of peace. At least, that's what I used to think. There's this one route I've been running for years. It's a late-night haul, and the road cuts through miles of empty desert. It's not a route most truckers like to take, especially at night. It's isolated, with barely any stops along the way, and it's known for being, well, strange. I didn't pay much attention to the stories at first. Figured they were just tall tales drivers tell each other to pass the time. But now, I know better. The first time something felt off, I was about an hour into the drive. The sun had set, leaving the sky a deep, inky black, with only the occasional flicker of headlights from distant cars. The stretch of road I was on was notorious for being desolate. No buildings, no rest stops, just flat, empty land as far as the eye could see. Even with the radio playing softly, there was a stillness that settled in my chest, a sense that I was the only one out there. I was cruising along, minding my own business, when my CB radio crackled to life. The static was loud and sudden, making me jump. I adjusted the dial, expecting it to be nothing more than interference, but the crackling continued, more persistent now. Then, faintly through the static, I heard a voice. It was hard to make out at first, like someone was whispering from miles away. But as I listened, the words became clearer. Breaker 19. Anyone out there? I frowned, glancing at the CB radio. It wasn't unusual to hear other truckers on the line, especially late at night, but this voice was different. There was something off about it, something that sent a shiver down my spine. Yeah, I'm here, I replied, my voice sounding too loud in the quiet cab. What's going on? For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then, the voice came through again, clearer this time. Watch out. Mile marker 223. Stay off that stretch. I blinked, caught off guard. Mile marker 223. That was coming up in about 20 miles. I hadn't heard of any issues on the route. No road closures, no accidents. And who was this guy anyway? I hadn't passed any other trucks in hours. Everything all right up ahead? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Again, nothing but static. I waited, listening for a response, but the radio was silent. I shook my head, telling myself it was probably just someone messing around, maybe some bored driver trying to spook me. But still, something about the way that voice had sounded, so distant, so strange, made me uneasy. As I got closer to mile marker 223, the road seemed to change. The air felt heavier, thicker somehow, and the darkness seemed darker, like the headlights weren't cutting through it the way they should. The hum of the engine, usually a comforting sound, started to feel oppressive. I glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 2:17 a.m. The witching hour, as they call it. I kept my eyes on the road, half expecting to see something, anything out of the ordinary, but it was just the same endless highway, mile after mile of blacktop stretching into the distance. Nothing ahead but darkness, nothing behind but the glow of my taillights. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a shadow moving in the corner of my vision. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a shadow at all. There was something, or someone, standing on the side of the road, right at mile marker 223. I slowed the rig down, squinting through the windshield. It was a figure, tall and motionless, standing just beyond the reach of my headlights. The closer I got, the clearer it became. It was a man, dressed in an old, dusty jacket and worn jeans. His face was obscured by the shadows, but there was something about the way he stood there so still that made my stomach twist. I considered stopping, maybe offering help, but something deep inside me screamed not to. There was no way a person should be out here, in the middle of nowhere, at this time of night. I had passed no cars, no broken-down vehicles, and yet, there he was, standing on the shoulder of the road like he was waiting for something, or someone. I kept my foot on the gas, speeding up slightly as I passed him. I didn't look back, didn't dare. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. As I drove past, I caught one final glimpse of him in the side mirror. He hadn't moved, not an inch, just stood there, watching me as I disappeared down the road. For the next few miles, my heart raced. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure following me. But there was nothing, just the empty road behind me, stretching on into the night. I tried to shake it off, told myself it was just some hitchhiker, maybe someone who had gotten lost. But the further I drove, the more unsettled I felt. There was something wrong about that man, something that didn't fit. And then the CB crackled to life again. "Did you see him?" The voice was the same, that strange, distant tone that didn't quite belong. My throat went dry. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice shaky. There was a long pause, filled only by the sound of static. Then, the voice came through again, softer this time. "They say he's been out there for years. Never leaves, just stands there, waiting." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. Was this guy talking about the man I'd just seen? The figure by mile marker 223? "Who is he?" I finally asked, my voice barely a whisper. Another pause. The static crackled louder, like the signal was fading. And then, just before the radio went silent, the voice spoke one last time. "Don't stop. Don't ever stop." The rest of the drive was a blur. I kept the rig moving, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, my mind spinning with what I'd just heard. I didn't pass any more figures, didn't hear any more voices on the CB. But the tension in my chest didn't ease until I was miles away from mile marker 223. By the time I reached my destination, the sun was rising, casting a pale light over the desert. I parked the rig, shut off the engine, and sat there for a long time, trying to process what had happened. It felt surreal, like a bad dream I couldn't shake. I thought about asking other truckers if they'd seen the figure or heard anything strange on that route, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the fear of sounding crazy, or maybe it was the knowledge that, deep down, I didn't want to know the answer. I've run that route a dozen times since then, but I've never driven it at night again. And every time I pass mile marker 223, I can't help but glance toward the side of the road, half expecting to see him standing there, waiting. Because the thing is, I never figured out who or what he was, and I don't want to know. Some things are better left in the darkness, where they belong. So if you ever find yourself on that stretch of highway, alone in the dead of night, and you see a figure standing by the road, and keep driving, don't stop, don't ever stop. It's funny how quickly things can go from a fun adventure to something that sticks with you forever. We were supposed to be having a great time, a weekend road trip with some of my closest friends, just like the good old days before life got busy. You know the kind of trip where you laugh until your stomach hurts, stop at random roadside attractions, and blast music with the windows down as you leave the city behind. But that feeling didn't last long. What started off as a lighthearted road trip turned into something I still can't fully explain. It was the second night of our trip, and we were somewhere in the middle of nowhere, just south of the state line. None of us knew exactly where we were, and that was part of the thrill. We were winging it, letting the road guide us. The sky was a blanket of stars, and the air had that crisp, cool edge to it that made you want to roll the windows down just a little more. We'd been driving for hours, losing track of time as we laughed and reminisced, but then our GPS glitched out. The screen went black, then flickered back to life, only to show us a map with no roads, just a blank gray void. The car's system recalculated, then recalculated again, throwing out routes that didn't make any sense. I shrugged it off at first, figuring we were in a dead zone. It happens, right? But after half an hour of driving, the GPS was still out and we were running low on gas. "We should find a gas station," I said, glancing at the dashboard. "We're getting close to empty." Sam, who was driving, nodded. "Yeah, I'll keep an eye out." The road was eerily quiet, no signs of civilization in sight. Just long stretches of asphalt, flanked by dark fields and the occasional cluster of trees. No lights, no houses, no other cars, just us. At first, it was peaceful, but then that peace turned into a kind of tension. It felt like we were the only people left in the world. Anyone else getting creeped out? Or is it just me? Sarah, my best friend, asked from the back seat. "I'm with you," I admitted. "Feels weird out here." We all agreed. It was hard to put our finger on what exactly felt off. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was the fact that the GPS was still useless. Either way, the lighthearted vibe from earlier had all but vanished. About 15 minutes later, we saw it, a gas station in the distance. It was small, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. Its neon sign flickered faintly, casting a dull glow over the empty parking lot. "Finally," Sam muttered as he pulled in. The place looked deserted. There were no other cars, no movement inside the little convenience store, just the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above the pumps. We all got out, stretching our legs while Sam started filling the tank. "I'll grab snacks," Sarah said, heading toward the store. "Anyone want anything?" "Chips," I called after her. I walked around the car, trying to shake the unsettling feeling that had been gnawing at me since the GPS died. The night was silent, too silent. No crickets, no rustling in the nearby trees, nothing, just the faint hiss of the gas pump. A few minutes passed, and I realized Sarah hadn't come back yet. "I'll check on her," I said, heading toward the store. As I pushed the door open, a bell rang above me, though it sounded muffled, like the air was thick inside. The store was dimly lit, the aisles narrow and crammed with dusty products that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. "Sarah," I called, my voice echoing slightly. No response. I walked past the aisles, expecting to find her browsing for snacks, but she wasn't there. The place was empty. I felt a flicker of unease. "Sarah, quit messing around," I said, louder this time. Still nothing. I headed toward the back of the store, where a door led to what I assumed was a restroom or storage room. The door was slightly ajar, a faint light spilling out. I pushed it open, but all I found was a tiny, dingy bathroom, no sign of Sarah. Panic started creeping in at the edges of my mind. Where could she have gone? She couldn't have left without us noticing. I stepped back out into the main store, scanning the aisles one more time, just in case. That's when I noticed something strange. A magazine rack by the counter. The magazines looked old, like they'd been sitting there for decades. I picked one up, and my heart skipped a beat. The date on the cover was from 1998. I dropped the magazine, my hands suddenly clammy. This place felt wrong. The whole gas station, the empty aisles, the strange silence. It all felt wrong. I rushed back outside, my heart pounding in my chest. "Guys, we need to go," I said, my voice shaky. Sam looked at me, frowning. "What's wrong? Where's Sarah?" "I can't find her," I admitted. "She's not in there." "What do you mean she's not in there?" Sam asked, his face tightening with concern. "She said she was getting snacks." "I know, but she's gone." I insisted. "We need to go, now." The uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach was growing stronger by the second. Something was wrong, something I couldn't explain. I glanced back at the store, half expecting to see Sarah walking out with a bag of chips and a grin on her face, but the door remained closed. That's when the lights above the gas pumps flickered. Once, twice, then they went out, plunging the station into complete darkness. "Sam," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "we need to leave." He didn't argue. He yanked the pump out of the car, and we all scrambled back inside. Sam started the engine, but before he could pull away, something caught my eye. Out of the corner of my vision, I saw movement. A figure, standing near the edge of the parking lot, just beyond the reach of our headlights. It was too dark to make out any details, but they were there, standing still, watching. My heart raced as Sam hit the gas, peeling out of the parking lot. I didn't dare look back. None of us spoke as we sped down the highway, the gas station disappearing into the distance. For the next hour, we drove in silence, the tension in the car palpable. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure following us, but the road was empty. Eventually, the GPS blinked back to life, recalculating our route and guiding us toward a small motel just off the highway. We checked in, still shaken, but grateful to be off the road. The motel was old, but it was clean, and most importantly, it felt normal. Sarah hadn't returned, and I tried to push the growing panic to the back of my mind. We decided to report her missing in the morning if she hadn't shown up by then. But something was gnawing at me. The gas station, the magazine, the figure in the parking lot. It all felt too surreal, like something out of a nightmare. I lay awake in the motel bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of it all. Around 3 a.m., just as I was starting to doze off, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text message from Sarah. I sat up, heart racing, and opened the message. "Where are you guys?" I stared at the screen, confused. How was she texting me? I quickly typed out a response, asking her where she was and what had happened at the gas station. Her reply came almost immediately. "What gas station?" My blood ran cold. "We stopped at a gas station. You went inside to get snacks, and then you disappeared," I typed, my hands shaking. This time, the response took longer, but when it came, it chilled me to the bone. "I've been at the motel this whole time. Where did you guys go?" I dropped the phone, my mind reeling. How was that possible? We'd all seen her go into the gas station. We'd all been there together. I rushed out of the room, banging on Sam's door, waking him up. "Sarah's here," I blurted out as soon as he opened the door. "She's been here the whole time." "What?" Sam looked at me, half asleep and confused. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," I cried, holding up my phone. "She just texted me. She said she's been here the whole time." Sam stared at me for a long moment, trying to process what I was saying. "But we all saw her go inside the gas station." "I know," I whispered. "I know." The next morning, Sarah was sitting at the motel's breakfast area, looking as confused as we were. She swore up and down that she hadn't left the motel, that she'd gone to bed early after getting tired of waiting for us to get gas. We tried to make sense of it, but nothing added up. It was like the night had been a shared hallucination, a glitch in reality. We never found out what really happened at that gas station, but every time I think about it, I can still see that figure standing at the edge of the parking lot, watching us as we drove away. I've always loved the quiet, the kind that settles over a place when the world feels far away, when the only sounds are the occasional rustle of leaves and the gentle hum of crickets. My farm, tucked in the middle of nowhere, gave me that peace. No neighbors for miles, just wide open fields, a few animals, and endless sky. It was the kind of place where you could get lost in your thoughts, let the stress of the world melt away, But sometimes, that quiet can turn on you. Sometimes, it can be suffocating, isolating in a way that leaves you feeling like the last person on earth. I learned that the hard way. It all started with small, unimportant things. Or at least, that's what I told myself. First, it was the animals, my goats in particular. They had this habit of gathering around the barn at night, but lately, they'd been huddling closer to the fence, bleating nervously as if something had spooked them. I figured it was just a coyote or some other predator sniffing around. Nothing unusual. But then it started happening during the day. The goats would crowd together in the middle of their pen, eyes wide, staring at something in the distance, something I couldn't see. I'd walk the perimeter of the property, checking for signs of trouble, footprints, claw marks, anything, but there was never anything out of place, not a sign of anything at all. I convinced myself it was nothing. Living out there, you can't let every strange noise or flicker of movement get to you, or you'll drive yourself crazy. So, I pushed it to the back of my mind and carried on with my routine. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of something banging against the side of the house. At first I thought it was just the wind, maybe a loose shutter. But as I lay there, listening, I realized it was too deliberate. There was a pattern to it, like someone, or something, was knocking. I got out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed a flashlight and moved through the house as quietly as I could. The knocking continued, steady, slow. It seemed to be coming from the back door. I hesitated for a second, every instinct in me screaming to turn back. But this was my home. I wasn't about to let some random noise scare me out of it. I unlocked the door and yanked it open, shining the beam of my flashlight into the darkness. Nothing. Just the empty backyard, the faint outline of the barn in the distance, and the wind rustling through the trees. I stood there for a minute, scanning the yard, my heart still racing. The air felt thick, heavy, like the night itself was pressing down on me. But there was no sign of anyone, no tracks in the dirt. Eventually, I convinced myself it had to have been a branch or some loose debris. I locked the door and went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily that night. The next morning, I found the back gate open. I hadn't noticed it the night before, but it was wide open now, swinging slightly in the breeze. My stomach twisted. I always locked the gate at night. Always. I checked the latch, but it wasn't broken. It was like someone had just casually opened it and left it that way. That was when I started to feel it, that gnawing sensation in the back of my mind, the sense that someone was watching me. At first, it was just a passing thought, easily dismissed. But the more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it got. Days went by, and little things kept happening. I'd find tools moved from where I'd left them, gates left open, and sometimes the faintest trace of footprints in the dirt near the barn. The animals were still on edge, refusing to leave the barn unless I was with them. Even my dog, usually so calm and friendly, started growling at nothing, his hackles raised as he stared at the tree line. One evening, just before sunset, I was out in the field, mending a section of fence that had been knocked down. As I worked, I got the distinct feeling that someone was watching me. I glanced up, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the woods, just far enough away that I couldn't make out any details. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I stared at the figure, waiting for them to move, to call out something, but they just stood there, motionless, watching. "Hello?" I shouted, my voice sounding more uncertain than I wanted it to. Nothing. The figure didn't respond. They didn't move. I stood up, trying to act casual as I grabbed my tools and slowly made my way back toward the house. I didn't take my eyes off them, though. I couldn't. But as I reached the barn, I blinked, and they were gone. I told myself it had to be a trick of the light, maybe a shadow playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, set me on edge. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the knock to come again. But it didn't. Instead, it was worse. Around midnight, I heard footsteps. Not inside the house, but outside. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the house. I threw off the covers and scrambled to the window, peeking out through the curtains. At first, I saw nothing, just the moonlit yard and the outline of the barn in the distance. But as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw it. Movement near the barn. A figure, moving slowly, almost casually, toward the back of the house. I dropped to the floor, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe. This was real. There was someone out there, walking around my property like they belonged there. I crawled to the door, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I didn't want to alert whoever it was, but I needed to know if they were still there. My hands shook as I reached for the doorknob. I unlocked it, inching it open just enough to peek outside. The figure was closer now, maybe 20 yards away, their outline clearer in the moonlight. They were tall, wearing what looked like a long coat, but I couldn't make out their face. They were walking slowly, deliberately, like they knew I was watching but didn't care. I slammed the door shut, locking it as fast as I could. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold the lock in place. For the next hour, I sat in the kitchen, clutching my phone, even though I knew there was no signal. I debated driving into town, but the thought of stepping outside, of being out there alone with that figure, made my blood run cold. Eventually, the footsteps faded. I don't know how long it took, but when I finally got the courage to look outside again, the yard was empty. Whoever it was, they were gone. The next morning, I found more footprints. They circled the house, leading up to the back door, and then disappeared into the woods. The gate was open again, swinging in the breeze like an invitation. That day, I made up my mind. I wasn't going to sit around and wait for whoever or whatever. This was to get bolder. I called a friend in town and arranged to stay with them for a few days, just to get away, clear my head. Maybe, I thought, it was all in my imagination. Maybe I was overreacting. But as I packed my things, I found something that shattered that illusion. Lying on the porch, just outside the front door, was one of my tools, a hammer I hadn't touched in weeks. It was placed neatly on the doormat, almost like a gift, a reminder that whoever had been out there knew exactly where I lived, and they had no intention of leaving me alone. I spent the next few nights at my friend's place, trying to piece together what had happened. I thought about calling the police, but what could I tell them? There was no crime, no damage, nothing stolen, just the creeping feeling that someone was watching, waiting. A few days later, I went back to the farm, hoping the break would clear my head. But the moment I stepped out of the car, that familiar feeling washed over me. The animals were still on edge, my dog still growling at the tree line. And as I walked toward the house, I saw it, another gift. This time, it was a small pile of stones, neatly arranged on the porch. No footprints, no sign of how they'd gotten there. Just another reminder. I don't know who or what is out there, but I know one thing for sure. I'm not alone. In the silence of the farm, it's never been louder. You know those nights when everything feels just a little too quiet? The kind of stillness that makes you hear your own heartbeat, every little creak of your car, and suddenly, you're hyper-aware of just how alone you are. I wasn't expecting anything unusual that night, just another late drive home after visiting a friend across the state. But there I was, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter as I cruised down an empty stretch of highway with nothing but my headlights cutting through the darkness ahead. It had been a long day, and my eyelids were starting to get heavy. The soft hum of the engine and the rhythmic sound of the tires on the road weren't helping my fatigue. I glanced at the clock, 12:47 a.m. The next town wasn't for another 30 miles, but I figured I'd make it there easily if my car held up. Suddenly, the engine sputtered. A small jolt ran through the car, and I instinctively leaned forward, as if that could somehow fix whatever was happening. The dashboard lights flickered, and then, without warning, the engine died completely. My heart sank. The power steering cut out, and the car started to slow down on its own as I desperately coasted to the side of the road. "Are you kidding me?" I muttered, pulling the car to a stop on the shoulder. I took a deep breath, hoping it was just some weird glitch. But as I tried the ignition again, the engine only cranked weakly before falling silent. I tried again, and again. Nothing. The reality hit me. I was stuck in the middle of nowhere. Alone. No lights, no passing cars, just a vast expanse of darkness on a deserted highway. The stars above were bright, but even they felt distant, like they couldn't care less about my predicament. I fumbled for my phone, hoping I had some service. I glanced at the screen. No signal. Of course. I sighed and leaned my head back against the seat, weighing my options. I could wait for a passing car, but I hadn't seen one for what felt like hours. Or I could start walking, though I had no idea how far I was from any sign of civilization. As I sat there, debating what to do next, I noticed a flicker of light in my rearview mirror. It was faint at first, but it grew brighter with each passing second. Relief flooded me. Finally, someone else was on this godforsaken road. Maybe they'd stop and help. The lights were approaching slowly, and something about that gave me pause. I turned in my seat to get a better look. The car, or whatever it was still a good distance away, but it was moving at an oddly measured pace. It wasn't speeding by like most cars do on an open highway late at night. Instead, it crept closer, almost cautiously, as if whoever was driving was in no rush. I glanced down at my phone again. Still no signal. The headlights continued their slow approach, casting long shadows across the highway. I rolled down my window, hoping to wave them down, but as the vehicle neared, something about the way it moved gave me an unsettling feeling. It wasn't just the speed, it was the silence. No engine noise, no tires crunching on the asphalt, just the sound of the wind blowing across the empty fields. By the time the vehicle pulled up behind me, I could feel my pulse in my throat. I leaned out of the window, my arm raised in a weak attempt to signal them. But the car, if you could even call it that, just sat there. Its headlights illuminated the back of my car, casting a harsh glare into my rearview mirror. But no one stepped out. I waited, expecting the driver to emerge, but the door never opened. I called out, my voice shaky. "Hey, do you have a phone? I'm stuck out here." No response. I swallowed hard, my hand still resting on the door handle. My instincts were screaming at me not to get out, but what other choice did I have? I opened the door slowly, the creak of the hinges sounding way louder in the silence than it should have. My feet hit the pavement, and the moment I stood up, the headlights shut off. The sudden darkness made me freeze in place, my eyes struggling to adjust. For a split second, I thought maybe they were conserving power, or maybe they just didn't want to blind me. But as my vision adjusted, I realized something was off. The vehicle, or whatever it was, wasn't just silent. It was completely dark now, blending into the night. I could barely make out its shape, but it was larger than I'd expected. No car should have been that big. I felt a chill run down my spine. My breath quickened, and I stepped back, my instincts telling me to retreat. But as I did, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from the direction of the now hidden vehicle. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to see who, or what, was approaching. The footsteps stopped just as abruptly as they had started. I stood there, my breath shallow, waiting for something, anything to happen. But the silence stretched on. No voices, no movement, just the eerie stillness of the night. I quickly climbed back into my car, slamming the door shut. My hands were trembling as I fumbled for the locks. I didn't know what was out there, but I wasn't about to find out. I just needed to wait it out. Maybe the vehicle would leave. Maybe someone else would drive by soon. But every second felt like an eternity. Then, a soft tap on my window. I jumped, my heart nearly leaping out of my chest. I turned slowly, dreading what I might see. But there was nothing. No one standing there, no face pressed against the glass. Just the same dark, empty road. Another tap, this time from the other side of the car. My eyes darted to the passenger window, but again there was nothing there. I reached for my phone again, though I knew there was still no signal. I just needed something to hold on to, something to make me feel like I had control of the situation. But as I gripped the phone, the tapping grew more insistent, faster, louder, as if whatever was out there was growing impatient. I couldn't take it anymore. Without thinking, I hit the horn, the loud blare cutting through the night. For a brief moment, the tapping stopped, and I allowed myself a sliver of hope that maybe it had scared off whatever or whoever was out there. But then I saw it. A figure, standing just at the edge of the glow from my dashboard lights. Too far to make out any details, but close enough for me to see its outline. Tall, unnaturally still, just standing there, watching. My breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't think. All I could do was stare back, my eyes locked on the shadowy figure. Seconds ticked by, but it didn't move. It just stood there, like it was waiting for me to make the next move. I don't know how long we stayed like that, me, frozen in fear, and the figure looming just beyond the reach of my headlights. But eventually, my body took over, and I slammed the key into the ignition one last time. By some miracle, the engine sputtered to life. I didn't wait. I threw the car into gear and floored it, the tires screeching as I pulled back onto the highway. I didn't look back, not even once. All I could think about was getting as far away from that place as possible. I drove for miles before I finally allowed myself to breathe again, my hands still shaking on the wheel. I don't know what was out there that night, and I don't want to know. But I can still feel its presence every time I drive that stretch of highway. And I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting. You know those vacations that are supposed to be a chance to relax, escape reality, and leave all your worries behind? That was exactly what I had in mind when I booked a 7-day cruise. I needed it, a break from work, from stress, from everything. The open ocean, the warm sun, a drink in hand, it all sounded perfect. At least, that's how it started. But vacations don't always go as planned. Sometimes, things get weird. The first few days were exactly what I'd hoped for. I spent my mornings lounging by the pool, reading a good book, and my evenings enjoying the onboard entertainment with a cocktail in hand. I'd opted for a solo trip, and it was exactly what I needed. Just me, the sea, and no distractions. Well, that's what I thought. It wasn't until day 3 that I noticed something was off. I had a room with a private balcony, and every night I'd sit out there watching the stars. The sound of the waves was hypnotic, the gentle rocking of the ship oddly soothing. But that night, as I sat in my usual spot, I felt something strange. It was that eerie, unmistakable sensation that I wasn't alone. You know that feeling, like eyes are on you, even when you can't see them. I turned my head, looking down the length of the ship. Nothing but empty balconies. I scanned the rows above and below mine, expecting to see someone else out there enjoying the night air. But every cabin seemed dark, curtains drawn tight. I shook it off, trying to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. Maybe it was the wine, or maybe I'd been cooped up in my own head for too long. Either way, I stayed outside for another hour before heading to bed. The next morning, I forgot all about it. It was another perfect day on the ship. Breakfast by the pool, an afternoon nap in the sun, and a light breeze that made everything feel just right. But later that afternoon, while I was getting ready for dinner, something strange happened. I was brushing my hair in front of the mirror, halfway through putting on my makeup, when I glanced toward the balcony door. The curtains were partially open, just enough to let in a sliver of light. and standing there, just outside, was a figure. I froze, my hand still gripping the brush. It wasn't a shadow, wasn't a trick of the light. There was someone standing on my balcony watching me. My heart leaped into my throat. I couldn't move. For a split second, I convinced myself I was imagining it, that it was just a weird reflection or something. But then the figure shifted, just a slight movement, but enough to make my blood run cold. I dropped the brush and bolted toward the door, my fingers fumbling with the handle as I yanked it open, my heart pounding in my chest. But when I stepped out onto the balcony, no one was there. I leaned over the railing, scanning the balconies on either side of mine. There was no way someone could have climbed up or down. They would have had to be Spider-Man. The ship was moving, the wind tugging at my hair as I stood there trying to catch my breath. The ocean stretched out in every direction, endless and dark, and there was no one in sight. I backed into my cabin, slamming the door shut behind me, my pulse racing. What had I just seen? Was someone really standing there? I wasn't the kind of person to scare easily, but there was no mistaking it. Someone had been on my balcony, watching me. For the rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every time I passed a window or caught a glimpse of my own reflection, I'd feel that same prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it had been a crew member, someone checking the rooms, or maybe my imagination was getting the better of me. But the next night, things got worse. I'd just gotten back from dinner, feeling more relaxed after a few drinks and some live music, when I walked into my cabin and noticed something odd. My balcony door was unlocked. I distinctly remembered locking it before I left. I always did. There was something about being out in the middle of the ocean, with only a thin door separating you from the open water, that made me extra cautious. But now it was open, just a crack, but enough to send a chill down my spine. I stepped closer, my heart thudding in my chest. My hands were shaking as I reached for the handle, pulling the door open all the way. The wind whipped at the curtains, sending them fluttering into the room like ghostly fingers. I stepped out onto the balcony, half expecting to see someone waiting there, but it was empty. I leaned against the railing, staring out at the endless black sea. The ship's wake churned the water below, and for a moment the sound was almost calming. But then I noticed it. On the small table next to my balcony chair, there was something that hadn't been there before. A small object, barely visible in the dim light. I reached for it, my hand trembling as I picked it up. It was a matchbook, the kind you'd find at a cheap hotel or a roadside diner. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the worn edges, and noticed there was something written on the inside of the cover in messy, almost illegible handwriting. It said, "I see you." I dropped the matchbook like it had burned me, backing away from the table. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Someone had been in my room. Someone had left this for me. I rushed back inside and locking the balcony door behind me and pulling the curtains tight. I grabbed my phone, ready to call the front desk, to demand an explanation, but then I stopped. What was I going to say? That I found a matchbook on my balcony? That I thought someone had been watching me? It sounded ridiculous, even to me, but I knew what I'd seen, and I knew someone had been there. For the rest of the night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the ship, every distant voice in the hallway made me jump. I stayed awake, huddled under the covers, my eyes darting toward the balcony door every few minutes, half expecting to see that figure again. When morning finally came, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. I spent the entire day on edge, avoiding my cabin as much as possible. I tried to enjoy the cruise, tried to distract myself with activities, meals, and even a massage. But the unease followed me everywhere. That night, I decided I wasn't going to let it get to me. I was tired of feeling scared. I locked the balcony door, double-checked it, and got ready for bed, determined to put the whole thing behind me. But around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of tapping. At first, I thought it was just a dream. I lay there, half awake, listening to the faint, rhythmic sound. like someone gently knocking on the glass. It was coming from the balcony door. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, my eyes glued to the curtains. The tapping continued, soft but persistent, like whoever or whatever was out there wanted me to know they were there. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. With the beam of light cutting through the darkness, I slowly approached the door, my hand shaking. The tapping stopped. I reached for the curtains, hesitating for just a moment before yanking them open. The balcony was empty, just like the last time. But this time, the door was still locked. I stared at it, confused and terrified. The tapping had been real. I knew it had. But how could it have been if the door was locked? I stepped back, shaking my head, trying to make sense of it all. That's when I noticed something new. Something written on the outside of the glass, right at eye level. It was foggy, like someone had pressed their hand against the door and dragged it downward, leaving a trail of condensation. And written in the fog, just above the smudge, were 3 words. "Are you scared?" I stumbled back, dropping my phone. My pulse thundered in my ears, my vision going blurry for a second. I ran to the phone on the desk and called the front desk, my voice barely coherent as I tried to explain what had happened. Security arrived within minutes, checking the balcony, the door, everything. But of course, they didn't find anything. They assured me that no one could have accessed the balcony, that the locks were secure. They even suggested it might have been a prank by another passenger, though they couldn't explain how anyone could have gotten in. But I knew what I'd seen. I knew someone had been there. The rest of the cruise passed in a blur. I stayed out of my room as much as possible, keeping the balcony door locked and the curtains drawn tight. But no matter how hard I tried to shake the feeling, I couldn't forget those words. "I see you." To this day, I don't know who or what was lurking outside my room that night. But every time I think about it, I can still hear that tapping on the glass, and I can't help but wonder if they're still out there, watching someone else, waiting for their next message. There's something about being completely off the grid that both excites and terrifies me. The idea of leaving behind the chaos of the world, no phones, no internet, just pure, untouched wilderness, had always been one of the main reasons I loved camping. But there's a flip side to that isolation, a part of it that creeps up on you when the sun sets and you're left alone in the dark. That's when the wilderness doesn't feel quite so peaceful. It had been a while since I'd gone camping, so when my buddy Alex suggested a weekend trip to the remote mountains, I jumped at the chance. Just the 2 of us, a couple of tents, and the quiet of nature. The location was perfect, miles from the nearest town, deep in a national forest where few people ventured. No campgrounds, no RVs, just us and the wild. The drive out was long and winding, the kind where you pass fewer and fewer signs of civilization as the miles roll by. Eventually, the paved road turned to gravel, and after a good hour of that, even the gravel road ended. From there, it was a rough trail on foot, but that's exactly what we wanted. Isolation. We set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines, the air fresh and cool in the late afternoon. It felt perfect. No city noise, no distractions, just the rustling of the trees in the breeze and the occasional bird calling out in the distance. As the sun began to set, we started a fire, cooked dinner, and settled in for the evening. We talked, laughed, and drank a few beers, the firelight casting long shadows across the trees. It was everything a camping trip should be. But then, right as the conversation started to die down, we heard it. A faint tapping sound coming from the woods. At first, I thought it was an animal. We were out in the middle of nowhere, after all, so it made sense that wildlife would be moving around nearby. But the tapping was rhythmic, too steady to be some random creature rustling through the bushes. "Do you hear that?" Alex asked, his voice low. "Yeah," I replied, listening closely. The tapping continued, soft but persistent, like someone tapping a stick against a tree. It seemed to come from different directions, shifting from one side of the clearing to the other. My heart started to beat a little faster, but I told myself it was nothing. Probably the wind, maybe a tree branch knocking against another. No big deal. But the tapping didn't stop. As the night went on, the sound grew louder, more deliberate. Every few minutes, it would change locations, like something, or someone, was circling our camp. I glanced over at Alex, and I could tell he was on edge, too. His eyes darted toward the woods, trying to make sense of the sound. "It's probably just an animal," I said, trying to sound casual, though my voice betrayed the nervousness I was starting to feel. "Yeah, probably," Alex agreed, though he didn't sound convinced. We let the fire die down, and the tapping seemed to fade with it. Relieved, I crawled into my tent, figuring it would stop once we were settled in for the night. But as soon as I zipped up my sleeping bag and closed my eyes, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. It was closer now. Too close. I lay there, staring up at the dark ceiling of my tent, every muscle in my body tense. The sound was coming from just beyond the trees, moving slowly around our camp, methodically. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a deer, a curious animal wandering too close, but the pattern of the tapping was too deliberate, too human. I reached for the flashlight beside my sleeping bag and clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, casting eerie shadows on the walls of my tent. I hesitated for a moment, then unzipped the tent flap just enough to peek outside. The fire had died down to embers, and the night was pitch black beyond the glow of the coals. I scanned the perimeter of our camp, looking for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. No rustling in the bushes, no animals darting through the trees, just the tapping, steady and relentless. I was about to call out to Alex when I heard him zip open his tent. "Did you hear that?" he asked in a whisper, his face pale in the dim light of his flashlight. "Yeah," I replied, stepping out of my tent. "I can't figure out what it is." We stood there in the clearing, both of us holding our breath as the tapping continued. It seemed to be coming from the trees directly in front of us now, just beyond the fire pit. "Maybe it's the wind," Alex suggested, though we both knew that wasn't it. Before I could respond, the tapping stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse than the sound itself. We stood there, frozen, listening for any other noise. But the woods were completely still. No wind, no animals, nothing. "Maybe we should check it out," Alex said after a long pause. Though his voice lacked confidence, I wasn't exactly eager to go exploring in the dark, but I didn't want to seem like a coward either. So, I nodded, and we both grabbed our flashlights and headed toward the trees. The beam from my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the dense underbrush as we moved deeper into the woods. The air felt heavier here, like the forest was pressing in around us. We walked for a few minutes, but there was no sign of anything out of the ordinary. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing that would explain the tapping. Just as I was about to suggest we head back to camp, we heard it again. This time it was louder, more distinct. The tapping was coming from directly ahead, deeper in the woods. Alex looked at me, his eyes wide with uncertainty. "What do you think it is?" I shook my head. "I don't know." We kept moving forward, our flashlights sweeping the trees as we went. The tapping grew louder with every step, more insistent, almost as if it was leading us somewhere. And then, without warning, the sound stopped. We stood there in the middle of the forest, the silence pressing in on us from all sides. My skin prickled with unease, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Something wasn't right. "Let's go back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Alex didn't argue. We turned and started heading back to camp, but something about the woods felt different now. The trees seemed taller, the shadows darker. like the forest itself had shifted in the short time we'd been gone. As we neared the clearing, I stopped in my tracks, my flashlight fixed on something just ahead. At the edge of our camp, standing perfectly still in the moonlight, was a large figure. It was tall, much taller than any person, and its outline was distorted, like a silhouette stretched too far. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching us. "Do you see that?" I whispered, my throat tight with fear. Alex nodded, his eyes wide with disbelief. We stood there, paralyzed, staring at the figure. I don't know how long we stayed like that, frozen in place, but eventually, the figure began to move. It didn't walk or step, just seemed to glide backward, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. Neither of us said a word as we rushed back to camp, grabbed our gear, and threw everything into our backpacks. We didn't care about the fire, didn't care about leaving anything behind. We just wanted to get out of there. The hike back to the car was a blur of panic and adrenaline, both of us constantly glancing over our shoulders, half expecting the figure to reappear. But it didn't. The tapping had stopped. The woods were silent again, but that silence was more oppressive than ever. When we finally made it back to the car, we threw our packs in the trunk and sped down the mountain without looking back. Neither of us spoke the whole way home. I think we both knew that whatever we'd seen or heard wasn't something we could explain. It's been months since that trip, and I haven't been camping since. I'm not sure I ever will again. There's something out there in those woods, something I can't explain, and I'm not eager to find out what it is. Because sometimes, the quiet of the wilderness isn't peaceful. Sometimes it's a warning, and the next time I hear that tapping sound, I won't stick around to see what's making it. There's something unsettling about being deep in the woods, miles from anyone, with nothing but trees stretching in every direction. Some people find it peaceful. Me? I always found it a little unnerving, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. But that's the thing about hiking. You push through that discomfort because the adventure is worth it. Or at least, that's what I used to believe. I wasn't a novice. I'd been hiking for years, done everything from easy day trips to multi-day treks. This one was supposed to be simple, an overnight hike in a national park that I'd explored before. I had my gear packed, the weather was perfect, and the trail was well marked. Nothing out of the ordinary. I started early in the morning, the crisp air filling my lungs as I set off on the trail. The trees towered above, their leaves a rich green, filtering the sunlight into soft patches on the forest floor. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the distant chirping of birds. It was the kind of quiet I usually loved, the kind that let me disconnect from the world and just exist in the moment. But as the day went on, that quiet started to change. It wasn't sudden, just a gradual shift, like the forest was getting quieter, too quiet. The birds stopped singing, and the wind seemed to die down. It was almost as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, like something was watching. I told myself it was just nerves. Being alone in the middle of nowhere can do that to you. You start to imagine things, turn every rustle of leaves into something more sinister than it really is. But even with that thought in mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around midday, I stopped for a break near a small clearing. I sat on a fallen log, ate my lunch, and tried to relax. The sun was warm, and for a moment, I felt that sense of peace I'd been hoping for. But as I sat there, something strange happened. I heard my name. At first, it was faint, almost like a whisper carried on the breeze. I brushed it off as my imagination, but then I heard it again, clearer this time. "Jason." I froze, my sandwich halfway to my mouth. The voice was soft, distant, like someone was calling me from deep within the forest. I glanced around, but there was no one in sight, just trees and the empty trail. "Hello," I called, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. No answer. I waited a few moments, listening, but the voice didn't come again. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined it. It had to be the wind, or maybe some distant hikers, even though I hadn't seen anyone all day. I packed up my things and continued on the trail, my pace a little quicker than before. I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in my gut, but I tried to push it aside. I'd come out here to enjoy the woods, and I wasn't going to let a few strange noises ruin that. But as I hiked deeper into the forest, the whispers started again. Jason. This time, it was more persistent, like whoever was calling me was getting closer. I stopped in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice seemed to come from all around me, echoing through the trees in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice tight with fear. Silence. I stood there, my breath coming in short bursts, straining to hear anything else. But the forest was completely still. No birds, no wind, no footsteps, just the oppressive quiet pressing in from every side. I started moving again, faster this time. I didn't care about enjoying the hike anymore. I just wanted to get out of there, back to the safety of my car. Every step I took felt heavier, like the forest itself was closing in on me. The whispers didn't stop. "Jason, come here." The voice was closer now, louder. It didn't sound threatening, but there was something about it that chilled me to the bone. It was almost too calm, too insistent, like it knew I had no choice but to listen. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see someone standing there, but the trail was empty. Just a long, winding path disappearing into the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that something, or someone, was just out of sight, watching my every move. I picked up my pace and my mind racing with thoughts of what could be out there. Was it another hiker messing with me? Some kind of prank? But who would go through that much trouble, especially out here in the middle of nowhere? I told myself to stay calm, to keep moving. But the fear was starting to creep in. My legs felt heavy, and every time the trail twisted around a bend, I expected to see someone, or something, waiting for me. By the time the sun started to set, I was completely on edge. The whispers had become more frequent, the voice calling my name over and over, always just out of reach. It felt like I was being lured deeper into the woods, away from the safety of the trail. And then I saw it. Ahead of me, just off the path, was a small figure standing between the trees. At first, I thought it was a child, a small, pale figure, barely visible in the fading light. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. It wasn't moving. It was just standing there, motionless, staring at me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, fixed on me. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step back, my hands shaking. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were rooted to the ground. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, watching. The whispers grew louder, the voice echoing in my head. "Jason, come closer." I shook my head, backing away slowly. I didn't know what that thing was, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get away, to run as fast as I could. I turned and bolted down the trail, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees blurred around me as I ran, the sound of my footsteps pounding in my ears. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just needed to get out of the woods. But no matter how fast I ran, the whispers followed me. "Jason." I stumbled, nearly tripping over a root, but I forced myself to keep going. The forest felt alive now, like the trees were closing in on me, the branches reaching out to pull me back. Finally, after what felt like hours, I saw the parking lot ahead. My car was sitting there, a beacon of safety in the fading light. I sprinted toward it, my lungs burning, and slammed the door shut behind me. The moment I was inside, the whispers stopped. I sat there for a long time, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, trying to catch my breath. The forest was still, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I don't know what was out there that day. I don't know if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But I've never gone back to that park, and I never will. Because sometimes, the woods are watching. And sometimes, they call your name. The next day, I did some research trying to find an explanation. Maybe it was a local legend or a known haunting, but I didn't find anything. No stories, no warnings, just the same old national park website advertising peaceful trails and beautiful views. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw.